The cease and desist letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slapped against my mailbox like someone had personally declared war on my existence, and when I opened it to find the HOA demanding I remove my perfectly reasonable vegetable garden within 72 hours or face legal action, I knew exactly where to find the ammunition that would end this battle before it truly began. My name is Xavier Whitmore, and I had bought my house in Riverside Meadows, a subdivision outside of Phoenix, Arizona, about 8 months prior. The place seemed perfect when I moved in. Reasonable prices, decent neighbors, and a homeowners association that appeared, at first glance, to be relatively hands-off. That illusion shattered approximately 3 months into my residency, when I received my first violation notice for leaving my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. The fine was $50. I paid it, annoyed but willing to let it slide. The second notice came a month later. Apparently, my front door wreath was the wrong shade of seasonal colors, another $50. The third notice cited me for parking my work truck in my own driveway because it had a small company logo on the side. By the time the fourth, fifth, and sixth notices rolled in, I realized I was dealing with something far more sinister than a simple community organization trying to maintain property values. The HOA president was a woman named Karren Dempsey, and she embodied every stereotype associated with her name. Mid-40s, blonde highlights that looked like they cost more than my monthly utilities, and a permanent expression that suggested she had just discovered someone had placed their recycling bin on the wrong side of their driveway. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a custom license plate that read Ho Queen, which should have been my first warning sign. Karren had made it her personal mission to find me for everything imaginable. My grass was a 1/4 inch too tall. My mailbox post needed repainting. My outdoor light fixture was not from the approved list of acceptable fixtures, despite being identical to half the other lights in the neighborhood. Each violation came with a $50 to $100 fine, and each time I paid, the notices only seemed to increase in frequency. Then I planted the vegetable garden. I had spent 3 weekends in early March preparing a section of my backyard, tilling the soil, building raised beds from untreated cedar, and carefully planning which vegetables would thrive in the Arizona heat. Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, herbs, and a small section for lettuce and leafy greens. The garden was entirely in my backyard, behind a 6-foot privacy fence, invisible from the street or any neighboring property unless someone deliberately walked around to peer through the fence slats. Karren found out anyway. The violation notice appeared within 48 hours of me transplanting the first seedlings. It cited some obscure clause about unapproved landscaping modifications and demanded immediate removal. I ignored it. Another notice arrived a week later, this time with a $200 fine attached. I ignored that too. Then came the cease and desist letter, drafted by some attorney in Scottsdale who probably charged $300 an hour to write threatening letters to people who dared to grow their own food. The letter stated that I was in violation of multiple HOA covenants, that my vegetable garden constituted an unapproved structural modification to my property, and that if I did not remove it within 72 hours, the HOA would seek legal injunction and place a lien on my property for all outstanding fines, plus legal fees. The total amount listed was just over $4,000, accumulated from 8 months of increasingly petty violations. I sat at my kitchen table, reading the letter 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each word. $4,000 for having grass that was too tall, a truck in my driveway, and vegetables in my own backyard. The absurdity would have been funny if it was not actively threatening my financial stability. That is when I remembered something my real estate attorney had mentioned during closing, something I had not thought about since signing the mountain of paperwork 8 months ago. I dug through my filing cabinet until I found the thick folder containing all my closing documents, title insurance, deed, and various disclosures. Buried in the middle was a document I had barely glanced at during closing, a title report showing the complete chain of ownership for my property and the surrounding subdivision. I started reading, and what I found made me set down my coffee and read even more carefully. Riverside Meadows had been developed in 1998 by a company called Sandstone Development Group. The original developer had created the HOA, filed the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and then sold off the individual lots. Standard procedure for subdivisions. However, there was something unusual in the documentation. The original declaration of covenants included a specific clause stating that the common areas, the architectural control, and the enforcement authority would transfer to the homeowners once 80% of the lots were sold and occupied. This was also relatively standard. What was not standard was what I found when I cross-referenced the title report with the current HOA governing documents. The transfer had never been properly executed. I spent the next 6 hours going down a rabbit hole of public records, county clerk documents, and Arizona HOA law. The more I researched, the more clear the situation became. When Sandstone Development Group sold the final lots in 2002, they were supposed to file a formal transfer document with the county, officially relinquishing control of the HOA to the homeowners and transferring all common area property deeds to the Homeowners Association as an entity. They had filed the paperwork stating the transfer was complete, but they had never actually conveyed the deed to the common areas. The implications were staggering. The HOA had been operating for over 2 decades under the assumption that they owned and controlled the common areas, the entrance monuments, the landscaping along the main roads, the small retention pond, and most importantly, the private streets throughout the subdivision. But according to the county records, those properties were still titled to Sandstone Development Group. I kept digging. Sandstone Development Group had dissolved in 2005 after the principal owner, a man named Robert Sandstone, passed away. The company assets had been liquidated and distributed according to his estate planning documents. I requested copies of the estate records from the county probate court, and what I received 2 days later was even more interesting. Robert Sandstone's estate had been inherited by his only daughter, who sold off most of the company assets, but retained several properties that had unclear title status or ongoing legal complications. Those properties were transferred to a holding LLC called Desert Holdings Group, which was registered as an Arizona limited liability company with a business address in Tempe. The company had been largely dormant since its creation, maintaining minimal tax filings and no active business operations. I traced Desert Holdings Group through the Arizona Corporation Commission records and discovered that the company had a single managing member, Robert Sandstone's daughter, who had passed away in 2018. Her estate had been probated, and her assets, including her ownership interest in Desert Holdings Group, had been inherited by her only son, who was listed in the public records as living in Seattle, Washington. This was where it got really interesting. I called the number listed for Desert Holdings Group and got a disconnected message. I tried searching for the heir and found a LinkedIn profile that matched the name and location. I sent a carefully worded message explaining that I was trying to track down the ownership of a property asset that appeared to be held by Desert Holdings Group and asking if he would be willing to discuss the matter. He responded within 3 hours. His name was Michael Garrison. He was 34 years old, worked in tech in Seattle, and had no idea that he owned an LLC that held property rights in a Phoenix subdivision. He told me that when his mother passed away, the estate attorney had transferred everything to him, but most of it was just old business entities that his grandfather had created. He had never looked into Desert Holdings Group because it had no active operations and no apparent value. I explained the situation. I told him about the common areas, the private streets, the HOA that had been collecting dues and issuing fines without actually having legal ownership of the property they claimed to control. I told him that according to my research, his LLC technically owned the deed to approximately 30 acres of common area property within Riverside Meadows, property that was currently being maintained and controlled by an HOA that had no legal authority to do so. "So what does that mean exactly?" Michael asked over the phone. I had called him after exchanging several messages, and he sounded genuinely confused. "Ifra. It means that your LLC owns property that is worth quite a bit of money, and it also means that the HOA has been operating under false pretenses for over 20 years, I explained. More importantly for my immediate situation, It means they have no legal authority to enforce any of their rules or issue any fines because they do not actually own the property that gives them that authority. There was a long pause. And you are telling me this because? Because I want to buy it from you, I said. The property, the deed, all of it. I will pay you fair market value for 30 acres of common area land in a Phoenix subdivision. I had it appraised, and based on comparable sales, I am prepared to offer you $80,000. Michael was quiet for a moment. You want to pay me $80,000 for property I did not even know I owned? Yes. And then what are you going to do with it? I smiled, even though he could not see me. I'm going to make sure the HOA understands that they do not run this neighborhood anymore. I'm going to restructure how things operate around here, and I'm going to make sure Karren Dempsey never sends me another violation notice for growing tomatoes in my own backyard. Michael laughed. It was a genuine surprised laugh. You know what? I like you, and I hate HOAs. My condo building in Seattle has one, and they are the worst. Send me the paperwork. If everything checks out, you have got a deal. I spent the next week working with my real estate attorney to draft the purchase agreement. We had to track down additional documentation proving the chain of title, verify that Desert Holdings Group did indeed own the property free and clear, and structure the transaction in a way that would hold up to legal scrutiny. My attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s named Patricia Chen, kept giving me looks that suggested she thought I was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. You understand that this is going to create an enormous legal mess, right? She said during one of our meetings. The HOA is going to fight this. They are going to claim adverse possession, or that the transfer was implied, or any number of other legal theories. Let them fight, I said. I have got the deed. Possession is 9/10 of the law, right? That is not actually how property law works, Patricia said dryly, but in this case, you might have a point. Arizona has very specific requirements for HOA formation and property transfer. If they never properly received the deed to the common areas, they have been operating as an unauthorized entity. Every fine they have issued, every lien they have placed, every enforcement action they have taken could be considered legally void. That is exactly what I am counting on. The transaction closed on a Friday afternoon. Michael signed the deed transfer electronically from Seattle. I wired $80,000 from my savings account, money I had been carefully accumulating over 5 years of working as a commercial electrician, and Patricia filed the new deed with the Maricopa County Recorder's Office. By 5 p.m., I was the legal owner of every common area in Riverside Meadows Subdivision. I waited until Monday morning to respond to Karren's cease and desist letter. I drafted my response carefully with Patricia's help, making sure every word was precise and legally defensible. The letter was simple and direct. It explained that I had received her cease and desist demand, that I found it amusing that an organization with no legal authority was threatening legal action, and that I was enclosing a copy of the newly recorded deed showing that I now owned all common area property in Riverside Meadows, including the private streets, the entrance monuments, the retention pond, and all landscaping maintained by HOA dues. The letter further explained that effective immediately, I would be assuming control of all common areas, that the HOA was hereby notified that they no longer had any authority to collect dues or issue fines, and that any attempt to do so would be considered harassment and would result in legal action. I also included a demand that the HOA immediately cease all enforcement activities and refund all fines that had been collected over the previous 12 months, as those fines had been issued without legal authority. The final paragraph was my favorite part. I stated that I would be willing to discuss a potential easement agreement that would allow the HOA to continue maintaining the common areas, but only if they agreed to completely rewrite their covenants and restrictions to remove all of the petty, overreaching rules that had been used to harass homeowners. I also demanded that Karren Dempsey resign as HOA president as a condition of any negotiation. I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested, and also emailed a copy to every address I could find associated with the HOA board. Then I sat back and waited for the explosion. It took 36 hours. Karren showed up at my door on Wednesday afternoon, her face so red I briefly worried she might have a stroke on my front porch. She was clutching a copy of my letter in one hand and shaking it at me like it was a weapon. "This is fraud," she shouted before I even had a chance to say hello. "This is illegal. You cannot just buy the common areas. That is not how this works." "Actually, it is exactly how it works," I said calmly. I had been expecting this confrontation and had mentally prepared for it. I purchased property that was legally owned by a private entity. The deed was properly transferred and recorded with the county. Everything was done by the book. "The HOA owns those common areas," Karren insisted. "We have been maintaining them for 20 years. You cannot just take them." "The HOA never received a deed to those properties," I explained. "The original developer never completed the transfer. I have copies of all the county records if you would like to review them. Your organization has been operating under the false assumption that you owned property you never legally acquired." "I will sue you," Karren threatened. "I will sue you for everything you have got. The HOA has attorneys. We will fight this." "Feel free," I said. "I have got a very good attorney too, and she is confident that my claim to the property is ironclad. But I am not interested in fighting. I sent you a letter outlining terms for an agreement. If you want to discuss those terms reasonably, I am happy to talk. If you want to continue threatening me, you can leave my property right now." Karren stared at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "You are doing this because of your stupid garden. This is all because you want to break the rules." "No," I said, my voice hardening. "I am doing this because you have spent 8 months harassing me and every other homeowner in this subdivision over petty, meaningless violations. I am doing this because you treat this HOA like your personal fiefdom and the rest of us like your subjects. I am doing this because somebody needed to stand up to you, and I found a way to do it." "The other homeowners support me," Karren said. "They value property values and community standards. You will be the pariah here, not me." "We will see about that," I said, and closed the door in her face. Karren's prediction about community support turned out to be spectacularly wrong. Within a week of sending my letter to the HOA board, I started receiving calls, emails, and visits from other homeowners in the subdivision. The first was my next-door neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, who brought me cookies and thanked me for standing up to the HOA. "I have been fined 12 times in the last year," she told me, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee. 12 times, for things like my porch light being out for 3 days when I was visiting my daughter, or my lawn being watered on the wrong day of the week. I am on a fixed income. Those fines add up. More stories followed. A young couple with 2 kids who had been fined for leaving a basketball hoop in their driveway. A veteran who worked night shifts and had been cited for mowing his lawn at 10 in the morning instead of between 8 and 9 like the covenant specified. A widower who had been threatened with a lien because he painted his garage door the wrong shade of beige, even though he had used paint from the HOA's own approved list. The common thread in every story was Karren. She personally drove around the subdivision looking for violations. She took photos with her phone and sent them to the management company that handled HOA enforcement. She attended every board meeting and pushed for stricter rules and higher fines. Several homeowners told me that she had tried to get elected to the actual board multiple times but had been rejected, so she had essentially appointed herself as an unofficial enforcement officer. I started organizing. I created a private Facebook group for Riverside Meadows homeowners who were tired of the HOA's overreach. Within 3 days, I had over 60 members out of approximately 120 total households. People shared their violation notices, their fine amounts, their stories of harassment. The total fines collected in just the previous year exceeded $200,000 for a subdivision of 120 homes. I also started digging deeper into the HOA's finances. As a homeowner in the subdivision, I had a legal right to request copies of the HOA's financial records. I submitted a formal request to the management company, citing Arizona Revised Statutes Title 33, Chapter 16, which governs HOA operations in the state. The management company tried to stall, but Patricia sent them a strongly worded letter, and the records arrived a week later. What I found was disturbing. The HOA collected approximately $400 per year from each household, totaling roughly $48,000 in annual revenue. The expenses for maintaining the common areas, insurance, management company fees, and other legitimate costs totaled about $32,000 per year. That left approximately $16,000 in annual surplus, which should have been building up a healthy reserve fund. Instead, the reserve fund had less than $8,000 in it. I went through the expense records line by line. There were charges for community events that nobody I talked to remembered attending. There were consulting fees paid to something called Community Standards Advisory Group, which appeared to be a sole proprietorship registered to Karren's husband. There were reimbursements for HOA president expenses that included things like office supplies, printing costs, and mileage for driving around the subdivision looking for violations. The more I looked, the more it became clear that Karren had been treating the HOA like a personal piggy bank. The amounts were not huge, usually a few $100s a month, but over the 4 years she had been involved with the HOA board, it added up to tens of thousands of dollars in questionable expenses. I documented everything and shared it with the Facebook group. The response was immediate and furious. Homeowners started demanding a special meeting to recall the entire HOA board. They wanted a forensic audit. Some were talking about filing police reports for embezzlement. Karren tried to fight back. She sent an email to all homeowners claiming that I was spreading lies and misinformation, that the financial records were being taken out of context, and that my purchase of the common area property was a fraudulent attempt to dismantle the HOA and destroy property values. She claimed that without the HOA's strict enforcement, the subdivision would descend into chaos and everyone's home values would plummet. Nobody was buying it. The special meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning at a community center near the subdivision. Arizona law requires HOAs to allow homeowner-initiated special meetings if a certain percentage of owners request it, and we had well over the threshold. The management company tried to control the agenda, but Patricia had helped me draft a proper notice of meeting that complied with all statutory requirements. The meeting would include a vote to recall the existing board members and elect new ones, as well as a vote to authorize an independent financial audit. The turnout was massive. Over 90 households sent representatives. The community center room was packed, people standing along the walls and sitting on folding chairs brought from home. Karren sat in the front row with 3 other board members, all of them looking increasingly nervous as more and more people filed in. I had prepared a presentation outlining everything I had discovered: the improper transfer of common area property, the questionable financial practices, the excessive fines for petty violations, and my proposal for how to move forward. I had copies of all the supporting documentation, including the deed transfer, the financial records, and the county records showing the original developer's failure to complete the property transfer. When the meeting started, the current board president, a mild-mannered accountant named Jerry, who clearly wanted no part of the drama, tried to maintain order. He read the meeting notice and explained the agenda. Then he opened the floor for discussion. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I connected my laptop to the projector and pulled up my presentation. For the next 30 minutes, I walked through everything I had found. I showed the deed records. I showed the financial discrepancies. I showed examples of the ridiculous violation notices that homeowners had received. I explained how the HOA had been operating without proper legal authority for over 2 decades. The room was silent except for my voice. People were taking notes. Some were recording video on their phones. Karren's face progressed from red to purple as I spoke, but she remained seated and silent. When I finished, I laid out my proposal. I would grant an easement to the HOA, allowing them to continue maintaining the common areas, but only if the following conditions were met. The entire current board would resign immediately. A new board would be elected with term limits and financial oversight requirements. All covenants and restrictions would be reviewed and revised to remove petty and overreaching rules. All fines issued in the previous 2 years would be refunded, and a full forensic audit of HOA finances would be conducted with results shared with all homeowners. And one more thing, I added. Karren Dempsey is permanently barred from serving on the HOA board or any committee, and she is required to repay all questionable expenses identified in the financial review. Karren finally stood up. You cannot do this. You cannot just take over the HOA. This is illegal. This is extortion. It is not extortion, Patricia said from her seat near the back. She stood up and identified herself as my attorney. Mr. Whitmore legally owns the common area property. He has every right to set conditions for how that property is used. The HOA has no legal standing to object because they never properly acquired the property in the first place. "This is insane," Karren said, her voice rising. "All of you are going to let this man blackmail the HOA? He just wants to do whatever he wants without any rules. Your property values are going to collapse." An older man sitting near the middle of the room stood up. I recognized him as Tom, the veteran who had been cited for mowing his lawn at the wrong time. "Karren, I have lived in this subdivision for 15 years. My property value has nothing to do with what time I mow my lawn or whether my neighbor has a basketball hoop in his driveway. You know what affects property values? Having an HOA that fines people thousands of dollars for nothing and makes everyone miserable. I vote we accept his proposal." A woman near the front raised her hand. "I want to know about these questionable expenses. How much money are we talking about?" I pulled up the spreadsheet I had prepared. Based on the financial records, approximately $23,000 in questionable expenses over 4 years. That includes payments to Karren's husband's consulting company, reimbursements for personal expenses disguised as HOA costs, and charges for events that either did not happen or were significantly overcharged. The room erupted in angry murmurs. Jerry, the board president, looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Another board member, a woman named Linda, stood up and announced that she was resigning effective immediately because she had no idea about any of the financial irregularities and wanted no part of it. Karren tried to defend herself, claiming that all the expenses were legitimate and approved by the board, that the consulting fees were for valuable services provided by her husband, and that the reimbursements were all properly documented. But nobody was listening. The mood in the room had turned decisively against her. The votes were called. First, a vote to accept the recall of all current board members. It passed with 87 votes in favor, 3 against, and 8 abstentions. Second, a vote to elect a new temporary board to serve until proper elections could be held. 5 homeowners volunteered, including Tom the veteran and Margaret my neighbor. They were elected by voice vote with overwhelming support. Third, a vote to authorize a forensic audit of HOA finances. It passed unanimously except for Karren's vote against. Fourth, a vote to accept my proposal for the easement agreement, subject to the new board negotiating final terms. It passed with 82 votes in favor. The final vote was on whether to pursue legal action against Karren Dempsey for misappropriation of HOA funds. This one was more contentious. Some people argued that we should just move on and focus on fixing the HOA going forward. Others, particularly those who had paid the most in fines, wanted accountability. The vote was close, but ultimately passed, 61 in favor, 37 against. Karren left the meeting before the final vote was tallied. She stormed out of the community center, shouting that we were all making a huge mistake and that she would see us in court. Her husband followed behind her, looking embarrassed and defeated. The forensic audit took 6 weeks and cost the HOA $7,000, which was money well spent. The auditor, a certified fraud examiner recommended by Patricia, went through 4 years of financial records with meticulous detail. The final report was devastating for Karren. The auditor identified over $34,000 in improper expenses, significantly more than my initial estimate. The consulting fees paid to Karren's husband's company were for services that were never actually provided. The reimbursements for HOA president expenses included personal items like clothing, meals at expensive restaurants, and even a weekend trip to San Diego that was supposedly for an HOA conference that did not exist. The community event expenses were inflated by a factor of 3, with the difference likely pocketed by Karren or her associates. The report concluded that there was clear evidence of embezzlement and financial fraud. The new HOA board voted unanimously to file a report with the Phoenix Police Department and to pursue civil action to recover the misappropriated funds. The police investigation moved slowly, as these things usually do. Detectives interviewed Karren, her husband, and several former board members. They subpoenaed bank records and credit card statements. The evidence was overwhelming. Karren had been systematically stealing from the HOA for years, using her position to approve fake expenses and funnel money into accounts she controlled. In the meantime, I worked with the new HOA board to restructure how the subdivision would operate going forward. We hired Patricia to help rewrite the covenants and restrictions. We removed all the petty rules about lawn mowing schedules, approved paint colors, and parking restrictions. We focused on legitimate issues like maintaining property in reasonable condition, preventing actual nuisances, and ensuring common areas were properly maintained. The new rules were simple. Keep your property reasonably maintained, do not create legitimate nuisances for your neighbors, and pay your dues on time. No more fines for grass being a quarter-inch too tall. No more violation notices for holiday decorations being up a week past the deadline. No more harassment for having a work truck in your driveway. We also implemented strict financial controls. All HOA expenses over $500 required approval from 2 board members. Monthly financial statements were posted online for all homeowners to review. The management company was replaced with a more affordable service that had better accountability measures. Annual dues were reduced to $300 since we no longer needed to fund Karren's personal expense account. The easement agreement was finalized in July. I granted the HOA a permanent easement to maintain and control the common areas, with specific provisions that the HOA must operate in accordance with the new, simplified covenants and restrictions. I retained ownership of the underlying property, which gave me the ability to step in if the HOA ever went off the rails again. It was a backup plan. Insurance against future Karren Dempseys. The criminal case against Karren moved forward through the summer and into the fall. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office charged her with 6 counts of theft and fraudulent schemes. The charges were serious, Class 4 and Class 3 felonies that carried potential prison time. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutors were not interested in being lenient. The case had gotten some media attention, and the county attorney wanted to make an example of HOA board members who abused their positions. The trial was held in October. I attended several days of testimony, watching as prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically. Karren's defense was weak. Her attorney tried to argue that she had genuinely believed the expenses were appropriate and that any mistakes were honest errors in judgment rather than intentional theft. The jury was not convinced. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for November. In the meantime, life in Riverside Meadows improved dramatically. The Facebook group I had created evolved into a genuine community forum where neighbors shared information, organized events, and actually got to know each other. Without the constant threat of violation notices and fines, people felt comfortable using their properties the way they wanted. Basketball hoops appeared in driveways, vegetable gardens sprouted in backyards. Someone even started a subdivision-wide yard sale day that became a monthly tradition. My own garden flourished. The tomatoes produced abundantly through the late spring and early summer. The peppers thrived in the Arizona heat. I harvested zucchini faster than I could give it away to neighbors. The herbs grew like weeds. Standing in my backyard on a Saturday morning, watering my plants and enjoying the sunrise, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with defeating Karren or dismantling her petty empire. It was simpler than that. I was able to use my property the way I wanted, without harassment, without fear of fines, without someone peering over the fence looking for violations. Karren's sentencing hearing was emotional. The judge heard victim impact statements from several homeowners who had been harassed and fined excessively. Margaret stood up and talked about living on a fixed income and struggling to pay the fines while Karren was using HOA money for personal vacations. Tom talked about feeling unwelcome in his own neighborhood because he worked night shifts and could not mow his lawn during the approved hours. The judge was not sympathetic to Karren. She sentenced her to 4 years in prison on the theft charges, with the sentences running concurrently. She also ordered restitution of the full $34,000 to be paid to the HOA, plus legal fees and investigation costs. Karren's husband had cooperated with investigators and testified against her in exchange for immunity, which added another layer of humiliation to her downfall. Karren was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. I watched her go and felt no particular satisfaction or vindication. Mostly I just felt tired. The entire ordeal had consumed nearly a year of my life. I was ready to move on. Patricia and I grabbed coffee after the sentencing hearing. We sat outside at a cafe in downtown Phoenix, watching people walk by and enjoying the rare cool weather of late November. You did a good thing, Patricia said. Not just for yourself, but for everyone in that subdivision. That woman was a tyrant. I just wanted to grow tomatoes, I said. Patricia laughed. Sure, and I'm sure the $80,000 you spent on property and legal fees was totally worth it for tomato growing rights. Actually, I said, I had the property appraised again last month. With the improvements in the subdivision and the changes to how the HOA operates, property values have gone up about 6% across the board. My house appreciated by almost $15,000. And the common area property I own is now worth about $95,000 because there is interest from a local park district in purchasing part of it for a community park. So financially, I actually came out ahead. Of course you did, Patricia said, shaking her head with amusement. You always were too smart for your own good. Not smart enough to avoid buying a house with a nightmare HOA in the first place, I pointed out. True, but smart enough to figure out how to fix it. I sipped my coffee and thought about the journey from receiving that first violation notice for trash cans to sitting here after Karren's sentencing. It had been stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. But it had also been necessary. Someone had to stand up to the petty tyrants who used HOAs as personal power trips. Someone had to say, enough was enough. The aftermath continued into December. The HOA received restitution payments from Karren's seized bank accounts and the forced sale of some of her personal property. The money was used to refund excessive fines to homeowners and to build up the reserve fund to proper levels. Several homeowners who had been threatened with liens discovered that those liens were legally void, since the HOA had never had proper authority to place them in the first place. Those homeowners got their credit reports corrected and, in a couple of cases, filed their own lawsuits against the management company that had helped enforce the illegal liens. The subdivision transformed. New families moved in, attracted by the reasonable HOA rules and the improving community atmosphere. The entrance monuments got repainted and landscaped by volunteers rather than expensive contractors. The retention pond became a gathering spot where kids fed ducks and families had picnics. People actually knew their neighbors now. I continued working as a commercial electrician, taking on projects around Phoenix and saving money for future investments. The vegetable garden became a year-round operation, with cool season crops in winter and heat-tolerant varieties in summer. I started teaching a gardening class at the community center, sharing what I had learned about growing food in the Arizona climate. 15 people showed up to the first class. By the third class, I had over 30 participants, many of them from Riverside Meadows. Margaret became the new HOA president after the temporary board held proper elections in January. She ran on a platform of minimal interference and maximum community building. She won by a landslide. Under her leadership, the HOA focused on organizing neighborhood events, maintaining common areas to a reasonable standard, and staying out of people's personal business. The monthly board meetings went from contentious battles to brief, boring affairs where the most controversial topic might be which landscaping company to hire for the spring cleanup. One Saturday in late March, almost exactly a year after I had planted my first vegetables, the subdivision held a spring festival in the common area near the retention pond. There were food trucks, a bounce house for kids, live music from a local band, and tables set up for various community groups. I volunteered to run a gardening information booth, handing out seed packets and advice to anyone interested. Tom stopped by with his grandkids. "You know, I never thanked you properly for what you did," he said. "This place feels like an actual community now instead of a prison camp." "You helped," I said. "Standing up at that meeting, getting people to rally behind the changes. That mattered." "Still," Tom said, "you took the risk. You spent the money. You figured out the legal angle that made it all possible. Most people would have just paid the fines and kept their heads down." Most people did not have a real estate attorney mention something obscure about property transfers during closing, I said. I just got lucky and remembered it at the right moment. "Luck favors the prepared," Tom said, "and the stubborn." Margaret came by later in the afternoon, looking relaxed in jeans and a Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association t-shirt that someone had made for the festival. "We raised almost $2,000 today from vendor fees and donations," she said. "The board voted to use it for a new playground installation near the pond. Should be done by summer." "That's great," I said. "The kids will love it." "You should run for the board," Margaret said. "We have got an opening coming up when Linda moves to Tucson next month. You would be perfect." I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. I appreciate the offer, but I think I have done my civic duty for a while. I'm happy just being a regular homeowner now, growing my vegetables, going to work, living my life without violation notices. Margaret laughed. Fair enough. But the offer stands if you ever change your mind. As the sun set and the festival wound down, I helped clean up trash and fold tables. Families were packing up tired kids and leftover food. The band was loading their equipment into a van. The food trucks were pulling away, following the small private streets out toward the main entrance. I stood near the retention pond, watching the last of the sunset reflect off the water, and thought about how much had changed in a year. A year ago, I had received a cease and desist letter threatening legal action if I did not remove my vegetable garden. A year ago, I had been facing thousands of dollars in fines and a lien on my property. A year ago, Karren Dempsey had controlled the HOA like a tyrant, making everyone miserable in service of her petty power trip and personal enrichment. Now the garden was thriving. Karren was in prison, the HOA functioned properly, and the subdivision felt like an actual community. All because I had remembered something my attorney mentioned during closing and had the stubbornness to fight back instead of backing down. I thought about the cease and desist letter sitting in my filing cabinet at home, preserved as a reminder of how the whole thing started. I thought about the deed to the common area property, also in that filing cabinet, representing the nuclear option I had used to blow up Karren's little empire. I thought about the $80,000 I had spent, the months of stress and uncertainty, the risk that my plan might not work. It had been worth it. Every dollar, every sleepless night, every hour spent researching property law and digging through county records. Not just because I won, although that certainly felt good. It was worth it because I had refused to accept that someone like Karren had the right to tell me what I could do with my own property. It was worth it because standing up to bullies and petty tyrants is always worth it, even when it is expensive and difficult. I walked home as darkness fell, following the sidewalk along the private street that I technically owned, but had granted back to the community through the easement agreement. Lights were coming on in houses, families settling in for the evening. A couple walked past walking their dog, nodding hello. A group of teenagers were shooting hoops in a driveway without fear of violation notices. Someone was grilling in their backyard, the smell of barbecue drifting through the evening air. This was what an HOA was supposed to be. A simple structure for maintaining common areas and handling shared expenses, not a tool for control and harassment. It had taken dismantling the existing power structure to get here, but we had made it. My house looked welcoming in the twilight, porch light glowing. I walked around to the backyard to check on the garden before going inside. The spring vegetables were coming in strong, peas climbing their trellis, lettuce ready for harvesting, herbs filling the air with fragrance, tomato seedlings waiting to be transplanted once the weather warmed a bit more. The raised beds I had built over a year ago, the ones that started this whole mess, were neat and productive. I picked some lettuce and herbs for dinner, then headed inside. On the kitchen counter was the mail from earlier in the day. I flipped through it absently. A utility bill, some junk mail, a postcard from a neighbor who was traveling, and an envelope from the HOA. For just a moment, old instincts kicked in and I felt a surge of anxiety. Then I opened it and found a notice about the upcoming playground installation, a request for volunteers to help with the spring landscaping day, and a reminder that annual dues were due next month. No violation notices, no fines, no threats, just normal, boring HOA business. I put the notice on my refrigerator with a magnet and started making dinner, using the lettuce and herbs from my perfectly legal, no longer controversial vegetable garden. The house was quiet except for the sound of me chopping vegetables and the distant noise of the neighborhood going about its evening. It was peaceful, normal. Exactly what I had wanted when I bought this house 15 months ago. The legal battles were over. Karren was in prison. The HOA was functional and reasonable. Property values were up. The community was stronger. And I could grow whatever vegetables I wanted in my backyard without fear of harassment. Sometimes, standing up to bullies works out exactly the way it should.